Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill. I'm not in the garden today, but I'm going to be in the kitchen because I'm going to show you how to bake a pumpkin and make the best pumpkin pie ever. So stay tuned. Every year I like to grow either sugar pumpkins or New England pie pumpkins. You can see they're quite small, and the reason they're so good for a pie is that they don't have really moist flesh, and so you're not going to have a watery pie filling. But these are quite easy to grow, and this little guy is actually going to give me plenty of pulp to make a 10-inch pumpkin pie. So the first thing that you need to do is to take a baking sheet that has sides on it, just in case this leaks a little bit, and put a little bit of foil inside. And then you just set this here, and you put it into a preheated 350-degree oven for about 90 minutes. And what's going to happen is, as it bakes, it's going to kind of sink down into itself, and that is perfectly okay. You don't have to pierce it before you bake it or anything. It is so easy. So let's get it in the oven, and then I'll be back with you in about 90 minutes. So while the pumpkin is baking, I wanted to show you some of the winter squash I grew this year and give you some ideas about how you would prepare, bake, or cook them. So this is a small butternut squash. Here is a delicata squash. This is a vegetable spaghetti squash. And this is a cushaw squash. So if I wanted to make either a casserole, risotto, or some type of a stew, what I would do is I would use maybe either the butternut squash or the delicata squash or even the cushaw squash. And I would peel the outside, cut it open, remove the seeds, cut them into chunks, and add them to whatever it is you're making. If you want to have a mashed squash to put into a soup, or perhaps to make a squash pie, which I know sounds weird, but if you Google them and find a good recipe, definitely give it a try. Then what I would do is I would peel the squash, I would cut it into wedges, make sure you have the seeds out, cut it into chunks, and then add them to water in a saucepan and steam it until it's nice and soft, and then you would mash it and add it to whatever it is you're making. To bake a spaghetti squash, what you would do is preheat your oven to 400 degrees, and generally the best way to get them to bake quickly is to cut them in half lengthwise, scoop out the seeds, maybe brush a little bit of olive oil on the cut surfaces, place them cut side down onto a foil-lined baking sheet, and bake them for about an hour until they're tender enough to use. And then you just kind of flake the strands of the spaghetti squash apart, and you can use them in a casserole, but what I like to do is just to put a nice marinara sauce on it, maybe with some onions and mushrooms. So that is a really tasty way to do that. If you want to roast your winter squash, I would recommend using things like either the delicata or a butternut squash. You're going to cut them in half lengthwise, scoop out the seeds, maybe brush the cut surfaces with olive oil, and then you're going to put them into a 400-degree oven, roughly for about 40 minutes. And I would put the cut side down, or if you put the cut side up, make sure you cover the pan with foil, and that's just to make them bake more quickly and evenly. Okay, it's been 90 minutes. It is soft. It's very hot, so you have to be careful of that. I'm just going to take the stem off, and then I'm going to use a knife just to cut it partway open to let it cool. Be very careful of hot steam. There, you can see that coming out. So I'm just going to let it cool. And once it's cool enough, I'll scoop out the seeds and scoop out the pulp. Okay, my pumpkin pulp has cooled, so I've run it through our food processor to make it nice and smooth. And it really looks like the real thing, doesn't it? If you don't have a food processor, you could certainly mash it with a potato masher, or you could put it in a blender or use a stick blender, but really you want to have just a nice smooth puree. Now the pie recipe that I'm going to use comes from Martha Stewart's Pies and Tarts cookbook. And I cannot take credit for it, but it is the best pumpkin pie we have ever had. And it's very easy to find this book. I heartily recommend it because it is my favorite cookbook, and there's all kinds of fabulous desserts to make in there. So that's what I'm starting with. The recipe is called Sugar Pumpkin Molasses Pie. And the first thing we need to do is to make a crust. Now, of course, you can go to the store and you can buy a ready-made pie crust, but if you really want to go homemade, I recommend making your own pie crust. It's not hard, just takes a little practice, and pie crust is very forgiving as you're putting it into the pan. So even if it tears or you're missing a little something in one spot, it's not a problem. So I'm going to use my Betty Crocker cookbook pie crust recipe, and it's very simple. So let's get started. So here's my pie crust. You can see it's not perfect, but it still looks great. I'm currently preheating my oven to 375 degrees. Now let's make the filling. Okay, now I'm going to put the filling into the pie shell. And I'm going to bake it for 1 hour at 375 degrees. I just took the pie out of the oven, and the important thing to look for so you know that it's finished baking is you want to make sure that the center does not have a bit of a wobble to it. You really want it to look very firm. Sometimes the top of a pumpkin pie will crack open a little bit on the top, and that's perfectly normal, so don't you worry about that. So now I've got it on a rack, and I'm going to let it cool to room temperature. One thing I wanted to mention is that when you made your pie filling, if you had more than would fit into your pie pan, just put it into a dish and bake it alongside your pie. It makes a lovely pudding that is absolutely delicious. Okay, here is the finished product, and what I did is I took some toasted pecans and just put them around the edge and in the center. Now, something Martha Stewart likes to do is she takes extra pie dough and she sort of free-form cuts little autumn leaves out. And what you do is you bake them on a cookie sheet just until they're light brown. And then you take them out, let them cool. And then once the pie has cooled down, you're going to just place them on the top, just as a little bit of extra decoration. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving.